Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events.
This week I sit down with Jonathan Russell, head of policy at Quilliam. During our conversation, Jonathan talks about the state of Islamic extremism in the world, the three founders of Quilliam, all of whom were Islamists earlier in their lives, and the work of Quilliam, the world's first counter-extremism think tank, which was created to generate creative, informed, and inclusive discussions to counter the ideological underpinnings of terrorism.
All right, Jonathan, well, thank you very much for taking some time, and welcome to The Exchange. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I would love to start by talking a bit about you personally. I know you work for Quilliam, the organization. I want to talk a little bit about the details of what exactly they do, but if you could maybe explain kind of how you came to the organization and what your sort of educational and personal background is that sort of launched you into the trajectory of Quilliam.
Sure. So I've been at Quilliam 3 years now, and my background is one where I studied predominantly languages. I focused on French and German at school, and decided when I left high school, that is, that I wanted to study a new non-European language and broaden my horizons somewhat. I opted for Arabic, having had a deep appreciation for both religion and politics as I was growing up. I grew up in a very religious family in the Methodist Church, and a Labour voting family. And I was always interested and asked to question those things as I grew up. And therefore, I think that's probably why I chose Arabic rather than something like Chinese or Japanese, where there's less open discussion about religion and politics. And so from there, I went to the University of Exeter. I studied Arabic and German and eventually Farsi for 4 years. The second year of which I was living in Cairo, Egypt, to improve my Arabic language skills. And then when I returned, I decided really at that point to pursue a master's in Middle Eastern history. I found it a bit embarrassing, to be honest, having graduated with a good degree from Exeter, that I could speak the language, but really had no deep understanding about the history or the culture or the politics, despite that being my reason to go and study in the first place. So I went to LSE, the London School of Economics here in London, and studied the history of international relations. And I focused on Middle Eastern history and British intervention in the Middle East. And from there, I focused on the emergence of Iran as a modern nation state, the history of British intervention in the Middle East, and the rise of political Islam in the 20th century. And during that time, I interned at Quilliam, having relatively recently found out about them. So that was back in 2012. And I worked very closely with our head of theological studies, Dr. Osama Hassan, as his Islamic studies intern. And I've been at Quilliam ever since. So when I graduated from LSE, well, in fact, just before, Quilliam invited me to return and to do a bit of work for them in the fundraising department. And from there, I moved into the policy team. And that's where I am now as head of policy.
When you were living in the Middle East and studying the Middle East, how did that influence your perspective of the Middle Eastern world and of the Muslim world generally? Did you become more religious? Were you just fascinated by the history there? How did what you learned there impact the way you viewed that culture?
So it really is a full spectrum experience living in the Middle East. It's not enough, I don't think, just to study a language without living there. And I think it's insufficient living there without studying the language. It's really, I found a delight to all the senses living in a place like Cairo, which is such a busy city, equally such a dirty city, but a city where the people are so welcoming, and don't demand you to speak Arabic whatsoever, but really to appreciate everything, even to appreciate the full range of the food on offer in a place like Cairo. I found that speaking the language was so great, and it did teach me a lot. It taught me. I think the best example is the number of taxis that you have to get when you live in Cairo. Probably four taxis a day I got, because the smog is so bad that you really don't want to walk anywhere, and the heat is oppressive. And talking to taxi drivers, this is the best bit of getting the taxi journeys I found. Talking to four taxi drivers a day really does give you an insight into Cairene life. It's the same in every city. The taxi drivers know what's going on. They're the pulse of the city. And we used to talk always in Arabic, and it was great for my language skills. We always used to talk about history and talk about politics. And the way into those conversations tended to be either about my religion, or about my family background, or about why I was studying Arabic and my educational choices, or about my family and whether I was married and that sort of thing. It always got deviated at some point when people tried to convert me to Islam or tried to marry me to their daughters. But for the most part, we could have really interesting discussions about history and politics, and about religion as well. And I think as long as you're open to those sorts of discussions and are open to the fact that the people live very different lives to you, I think you can learn an awful lot. And it certainly taught me an awful lot as I was going. And remember, this was before the Arab Spring, so this was 2009 that I was there. When it has to be said, Egypt was not known for being open in its discussions of religion and politics. The people didn't appear in public to have a voice at that stage. It was only in January in 2011 when that voice started to come together. But I suppose, retrospectively, it's not a strange thing that the Arab Spring happened, because people did have these strong views. People loved talking about them and loved debating about these issues. And you could see just by meeting 4 taxi drivers a day that they really cared about these issues, which all bubbled up just 6 months after I left that city.
What sort of insights did you have, both in your study and in living there, talking to the taxi drivers, talking to people who live there? Did the people strike you as more religious and more wedded to Islamic ideology, or less so? What was sort of the takeaway from your speaking the language and living there in terms of how religious they were?
So for the majority of people that I met, it was clear that religion played an important part in their daily lives and in their personal lives. For them, overwhelmingly, it was part of their tradition, part of their culture, part of their family values. But what it was not at that stage, when I talked to all those people, it was not a political manifestation of their faith. They didn't see the connection between religion and politics whatsoever. They didn't talk about wanting to implement one interpretation of Sharia. They didn't talk about the return of the caliphate. They didn't talk about the need for the Muslim Brotherhood to come into mainstream politics and to win an election even. Those things weren't even contemplated or talked about in the conversations that I had with them. So yes, I got the sense that they were deeply religious, and you got that broader sense in the city as well. They say you're never more than 30 meters away from a minaret. And it was a delight, I thought, to wake up to the sounds of minarets, particularly on a Friday morning, and the big call to prayer as you approach Friday lunchtime. It was clearly a part of their lives, and it was very, very new to me. But I didn't feel that it influenced their day-to-day life beyond their personal life at all, and beyond the communities. It wasn't political whatsoever.
So talk to me a little bit about what exactly Quilliam does and what its goals are. And also, if you could speak to the point of what in particular drew you to them to make you want to spend part of your life working for the organization.
So I suppose following on from this manifestation of religion as a personal influencer, as I experienced in Cairo, what Quilliam tries to do is to tackle when that religious faith, that otherwise peaceful religious faith, is exploited politically and seeks to impose one interpretation of religion over the rest of society or over any other individual. What we call that is Islamist extremism. So we focus on how Islam is exploited. And what we're looking at really is a 20th century phenomenon. We're looking at the Middle East's answer to fascism or communism. The century of ideology really was also bubbling on in the Middle East. And what Quilliam looks at, analyzes, researches is this trend starting most principally with the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, founded in Egypt, through to its modern manifestation in Islamic State. And I'm not comparing the two. There's a whole spectrum of Islamist movements that have come about in the last 100 years. But Islamic State are very clearly at the fringe of that spectrum. But I think Quilliam tries to look at that as a holistic, as a trend and as a broader movement. And we seek to do three main things, really. We seek to reduce people's vulnerability to radicalization, to this form of extremism. We seek to inform policymakers so that they can come up with proportionate responses to extremism. So it's clear that it may be necessary and to have a kinetic response and carry out airstrikes against Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, but it's clearly inappropriate to do a similar thing against the non-violent Muslim Brotherhood on the streets of Britain. So to help policymakers understand the full range of that spectrum and the need for different responses to different elements on it. And then we seek to take the conversation forward in a religious sense as well. And what I mean by that is if Islamist extremists shout the loudest and are the only people offering an option for young British Muslims to believe in their form of Islam, then they're going to win. What Quilliam tries to do is engage with the scripture and find synergy between Islam and human rights, between Islam and British values, between Islam and liberal democracies, to show that there are other ways of integrating and other ways of being British and Muslim, rather than having to choose and prioritize just one element of your identity. Extremists, we know, play on that perceived inability to synergize the two, and we try to offer people a way out by giving them something else to believe in. And what drew me to Quilliam in particular was really growing up. The threat of Islamist extremism, of jihadist terrorism in particular, was very clear. So in my first year at school, the first week, in fact, at high school, 9/11 happened. And during my GCSEs year, so when I was 15, turning 16, 7/7 happened, the attacks on the London transport networks. Mm-hmm. And so peppered throughout my education has been this threat from jihadist terrorism. And I remember in my third year, during my classes then, there was a real sense of relief we heard from the American president, from Barack Obama, when Bin Laden was shot by those Navy SEALs. We heard various statements saying that this war on terror was over, that we'd won it because we'd killed the bogeyman. And it seemed to me, from all of my study, looking at this broad 80-year trend, that simply wasn't going to be the case, that you couldn't defeat this ideology simply by taking out the guy who was its most prominent supporter. And throughout my continued study during my master's year at LSE, that's what drew me to Quilliam, because it seemed to me that Quilliam was looking on the ground for answers to these questions and talking to the right people who had influence over policy, and engaging with British Muslims and other extremists who thought that they were responding to Islamist extremism, like the far right. I was attracted by all of those things and wanted really to do a job where I could engage with this battle of ideas. And I was very, very grateful when Majid invited me to work full-time here.
You touched on this a little while ago, and I think this is also a debate that we're having in the U.S. currently is beginning to try to explain who the people are that are attracted to these jihadist networks, where they come from, what their backgrounds are, what exactly is the incentive for them to join these sort of groups. I would love to hear your personal perspective, or maybe Quilliam's perspective on what the draw is for those people. I think I heard once that in the last couple of years, there have been more British Muslims that have joined ISIS than the British Armed Forces. What is your take or the organization's take on why that's happening?
It's a very good question. It's one we get asked a lot, and I think I'm always reminded of an advert we have here on the buses in London, and it's an advert to stop people travelling without a ticket. And the advert says, it's printed across the top line where people sit on the buses. It says, what does a ticket inspector look like? And then the answer is, just like you. And that's what I think about when I think about radicalization and profiles of vulnerable people to radicalization. The truth is that they don't look like anything at all. It's everyone who could be vulnerable to radicalization. There is no one profile that fits this form of extremism. It's clear that what we're talking about here is buy-in to ideas, and we're looking at humans. So we're looking at personal experience and various elements that might make people more susceptible to buying into these ideas. So in the broadest sense, we consider vulnerability, and that vulnerability might be a mixture of identity crisis, so not knowing their place in the world. That could be, British Muslims who might feel when they go home that they're not that their family want them to behave like a Pakistani family. When they're at school, they're being asked to behave like a British kid. When they're in the mosque, they're being asked to be Muslim, and they can't find a way how to synergize all these things. Or it could simply be that when young people go off to university and lose the support networks and start to have to find their own way, they gather that identity vulnerability in other ways. The other main thing that I suppose makes people more susceptible to these sorts of ideas are grievances. We hear a lot about why foreign policy causes radicalization. Well, I don't think it does, but it's clear that the lots of people who go to Islamist extremism consider the war in Iraq or the lack of intervention against Assad in Syria, or even the more recent airstrikes against Islamic State in Syria as chief motivators, as important grievances that justify their views in a warped ideology, and so I think that's insufficient. We know how extremist groups operate to exploit these grievances and to exploit this identity crisis. But it's buy-in to those sorts of things that really constitute vulnerability. And I think the reason for that is what extremists sell, if anything, is straightforward answers to complex questions. It's human. It's entirely human to be aggrieved at the world, and it's entirely human to be confused about the world, to have these identity issues. But what extremists are great at is offering an oversimplified solution that is broad enough to catch everyone, but focused enough to make it human and to make it personal and to make it feel as if they care about you. And that's a really, really hard thing to deal with. It's why misunderstanding of that process is why you get things like the British policy of stop and search in 2004 that that disproportionately stopped brown and black young men. Mm-hmm. And it's why you get people like Donald Trump saying, we've got to stop Muslims coming into the country. These things will not help stop radicalization. But I can see why they say them, because they fundamentally misunderstand what this process is.
One of the things I think that's most interesting about the organization is the genesis of the story of how the organization came to be in the first place. And I would love to have you maybe talk briefly about the founders of the organization, how they were radicalized at an earlier period of their life, and what it was, right? I mean, once you begin to deal with people that have that sort of simplistic worldview or are abiding by a certain ideology, it can be very difficult to penetrate them. What is the story of how the founders of Quilliam came to an Islamist perspective in the world, and then also in time came out of it and began to form an organization like Quilliam?
So there are three prominent former extremists at Quilliam, and one of them, Majid Nawaz, was the founder back in 2008, and he's written an excellent book called Radical. In which it's autobiographical. So it considers his radicalization to Islamist extremism in the first place, and how he ended up on the leadership committee of a non-violent Islamist group called Hizb ut-Tahrir here in the UK, and how during that time he traveled to Denmark and to Pakistan to go and set up branches and chapters of this organization, and how when he went to Egypt, as I did, on his year abroad to study language, although in his case it was curiously in September 2001, he was eventually arrested by Mubarak's government and thrown in prison for 5 years for subversion as a political prisoner, because he was a member of this organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir. It chronicles his 5 years in prison, during which he did several key things which I think are crucial to him leaving extremism and eventually setting up Quilliam. The first thing he did was he read an awful lot. He read about the religion that he was preaching, and he realized that there were very few political there was no political framework in there that he was using to justify everything that he was saying. He understood, therefore, in that moment, that he'd been manipulated by extremists, because they'd assumed that he hadn't read the Quran, and they were true. They were right. Only when he was in prison did he really engage with the scripture in Arabic and in English. The second main thing was humanity, I suppose, in that he was picked up by a prisoner of conscience, by Amnesty International, who, even though they disagreed with his political views and with his Islamist extremist views, and the fact that, caught up in that would have been that he would have, in an instant, put to death gay people, would have refused women the right to speak or even have a job. What they understood was, even though they disagreed with his views, they absolutely defended his right to have those views. And that's why they took him up as a prisoner of conscience. For Majid, that was important because it showed the humanity of everyone that he was struggling against, actually treated him like a human. And I think that rehumanized his enemy in his mind and softened his approach towards them. The third main thing was, while he was in prison, the 7/7 attacks that I mentioned earlier happened. And I think he realized that all the hate that he was preaching had manifested in a physical attack against his home city. And I think that brought it home for him that he was saying dangerous things. And in particular, what confused him about that was he'd seen the 1 million men marching on the streets of London opposing the Iraq War, more than any other city had managed around the world, more than anywhere in the Arab world, had come together to oppose what they saw as an illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. And so he thought it was completely unjust that jihadist terrorists would then target London, including some of those people who had protested the Iraq war, with their violence. And so those three things coming together, education, really, humanity, and this sense of injustice all came together to make him question the very foundations of his beliefs and the organization and the actions that he was otherwise prepared to carry out in the name of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And that prompted his move away from Hizb ut-Tahrir eventually a year after he got let out of prison. And soon after that, after he completed his studies, he set up Quilliam in 2008 with another former Hizb ut-Tahrir activist, Ed Hussein, who'd written an excellent book called The Islamist. And they set up Quilliam. And the stories of the other two former extremists at Quilliam are similar. But one, a chap called Numan bin Otman, is a former jihadist and was a member of Al-Qaeda. He is a Libyan, he was of Libyan aristocracy and was attracted, very politicized, attracted to go and join the Arab Afghans and the Mujahideen in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And there met with Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and other acolytes who eventually, after the war against the Soviets, looked to set up a new organization. And he used to live with them in Khost and then I think in the Sudan, where they moved afterwards. But eventually distanced from them in 1993 when Osama bin Laden switched his focus. For Numan, my colleague, he was always about opposing Muammar al-Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya. And for him, the best people to do that at the time were Al-Qaeda, who had gathered together these Arab Afghans. And when bin Laden announced that what he wanted to do was not go after the near enemy, as he saw it, but go after the far enemy and start attacking the United States of America, as we know infamously eventually happened in 2001. Numan reassessed and thought, well, you know what, my focus is still on Gaddafi. And so he left. He didn't renounce jihadism. He went back to Libya and set up his own group called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. And it was only after several years running that organization and eventually moving to London that he decided to also distance himself from that organization and distance himself from violence, to say, well, let's think about political and diplomatic ways of removing Muammar Gaddafi, and how can we work with civil society to challenge dictatorships as much as challenge Islamist extremism. And I suppose he was eventually proven right in 2011 when the Arab Spring came and removed Gaddafi with the Libyan uprising. That was a more effective way of doing it than all the years of jihadists focusing on Gaddafi. And then the third one, just quickly, is my colleague Osama Hassan, who is an imam. He is a sheikh. He memorized the Quran at the age of 7, and he made himself. He came from a very, very religious family, very, very learned family. Two famous theological families came together, and that's his heritage. He became a Salafi hate preacher, and Salafis are they believe in a very literalist version of Islam. They want to take the world back to the 7th century, the first generation after the Prophet Muhammad. And Osama preached this literalism and recruited for some time for the jihad in Bosnia. He recruited the then foreign fighter cause, as it was in Bosnia. But again, in fact, he had his frontline experience in Afghanistan as well, but eventually distanced himself from jihadism in 2005 after the attacks on London, and realized that as much as he felt it was important to be Muslim, he also felt it was important to be a Londoner. and with a young family in London, he realized that his words were coming back to pose a real threat to him and his family. And he's a remarkable man. He's continued his study. He has beyond memorizing the Quran at the age of 7, he has a PhD in astrophysics, artificial intelligence, and is as much a scientist as he is an imam, and received a lot of criticism, in fact, in 2012 when he showed the Islamic justification for evolution, and received a lot of criticism from his former friends as Salafis for questioning the idea that evolution happened, and so he joined Quilliam really as someone who's willing to stick their neck out and say, this is what I believe in, this is the evidence, I'm going to follow this evidence, rather than believing in something dogmatically and politically to pursue this ideological cause.
I'm curious about the moments of doubt for these men where the worldview that they held begins to change, if not crumble altogether. And it sounds like for each of them that was caused by a variety of different factors, education being one of them. What tends to be, from your perspective, the theological arguments or counter arguments to jihadists or Islamists that have been most effective? And maybe to speak about Majid specifically, I mean, what was it that was in the war of ideas that happens within all of our brains? What were the arguments that seem to eventually have won out from a theological perspective? And how does Quilliam try to utilize the knowledge that your staff has about the Quran to do that in the war of ideas in society generally?
So I think what these three men share in their religious belief is everything that's also shared by countless religious people across the world in all major religions. They believe in the golden rule. They believe that you should love your neighbor like yourself. And if that's the most important thing, and in an Islamic sense, what we're talking about is maqasid, the underlying values, the foundations, if you like, of the faith. They realize that the most important thing is not literally following scripture, devoid of context, either place or time, and just parroting something from the 7th century, but instead thinking about how the Prophet Muhammad might act if he existed in Britain in 2015, and therefore how his words can bear relevance to our situations here and countless other situations around the world. And the argument that they all share now is that overwhelmingly Muhammad would be a proponent of human rights and would probably be there with the feminists and there with the gay rights activists and there with other people pushing for free speech, probably. And I think that understanding is what drives them to oppose Islamist extremism, who one way or another will all agree that human rights are not universal and that people shouldn't be equal before the law. They're the two fundamental things in any liberal democracy, I think. And so they've found a way, and it's not a duplicitous way. I think it's absolutely what they believe in, of synergizing their duties as a fully functioning British citizen in 2015 and being a fully committed Muslim, following the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And so how is this relevant to de-radicalization, or how is this relevant to winning the hearts and minds of people who might believe differently? Well, I think they all understand how it can be made personal. Everyone at some point with their grievances will feel that their human rights have been taken away, or that they haven't been applied equally to them. It may be that someone has been discriminatory to them and hasn't allowed them to practice their faith openly. It may be for women that they've been treated differently from men. But people will only ever respond to or only many people will only think about human rights when their own human rights are taken away. And I think by showing the personal impact of this human rights deficit, gets people to think about their beliefs in a slightly different way, and start to think about why the only thing we can really push for is the universality of these values, and why everyone needs to have them if they're going to mean anything at all. And so what we try to do is talk about values and talk about these ideas, but apply them to a personal situation. And that's what these three in particular are so good at doing, because they've had the personal experience themselves of going in and out of radicalization. They recognize lots of the traits when we're talking to vulnerable people. They recognize lots of the personal experiences. They can say, I haven't just studied this, I feel it. I know. They can empathize, and that empathy is ultimately what's going to win out. If we're going to solve this and solve what seems to be a growing trend of radicalization, it's not going to be a top-down imposition. It's going to be a bottom-up, empathetic civil society approach. And I can see absolutely the roles of victims in that, and of formers. So formers are who we employ at Quilliam. But there's a role for victims as well. Victims of terrorism talking to perpetrators and talking to extremists and saying, look, this is what you created. This is the manifestation of your ideas. And so here's a very tangible example. We made over the summer a film called Not Another Brother. It's a counter-narrative film. And it's entirely intended to push back on some of the things that extremists believe and lots of ways that vulnerable people are exploited. And it focuses on a foreign fighter who's with Islamic State, reading out a letter from his brother saying, essentially, I'm sorry for putting these ideas in your head. I see how you're acting on them now. And the tagline of the film is, don't let your words turn our brothers into weapons. And that for me is an important message, and really sums up what we're trying to do by showing the link between extreme ideas and violent actions. We can start to shut down the willingness of people to use that violence and the propensity to commit acts of terrorism by questioning the extremist ideas or stopping people having extremist ideas in the first place. So I think Not Another Brother as a film is quite a nice pastiche of our general work.
Do you? I see this in the U.S. to some degree as well, but I think one of the reasons why it's difficult for people to publicly condemn or speak out against jihadists and Islamists is often out of fear of violence or retribution for that sort of public criticism or just critique of the religion or of that ideology generally. Is that something that you think about, or does the organization think about? And if so, or maybe in addition to that, have there been any attempts for violence to be rendered against the organization generally?
Yes, absolutely. So we have been told a number of times by the police and others here in the UK that we have been targeted by extremists, and we've been told that there will be plots in the future and that we should do various things to try and keep ourselves safe. They understand, and I commend them for this, they understand that we're not going to stop talking, we're not going to stop questioning these ideas just because we feel unsafe. And so they're willing to work closely with us to improve our resilience, if you like. And resilience is the key word for anyone in this field, because what we're opposing are people who don't play by our rules. They're willing to use violence indiscriminately. They're not like the Irish Republicans of old who phoned in their attacks or didn't even want themselves to die. They didn't pursue suicide terrorism. These are people who are willing to go full whack. And so I think you have to be resilient, and you have to believe in it, and you have to be willing to stick at it when the going gets tough. But the important thing is on our side of this debate, nobody's asking you to die for these views. It's only on the jihadist side that people are demanding that of you. So resilience is key. And I can absolutely understand why some people aren't willing to make that jump. And actually, I think people like us at Quilliam do it so that most people don't even have to think about it. And it need not affect their daily life. But it would make our life a lot easier. It would make the struggle against Islamist extremism a lot easier the more people that come into it, because if we can build critical mass against this ideology, against these narratives, and against this movement, then we will start to get security in numbers, and I think that's important. But the debate here in the UK is always about the role of Muslim communities in tackling Islamist extremism. It seems to me that the British Muslims might have more of an impact than I will in tackling extremism if they were to fully understand it, because they would be able to identify extremists in their midst. They'd be able to make more compelling arguments against the exploitation of that theology to make this Islamist ideology. And they'd be able to show positive examples of their engagement and integration with British society in a way that I simply can't as a non-Muslim employee of Quilliam. But what I don't ask of them is to apologize for Islamist extremists, and I think that's very, very important. That's a misconception very often that asking Muslim communities to do something, to work with us hand in hand to counter-extremism, is very different from asking them to apologize. I don't think they have anything to apologize for, and so we're asking people to be proactive rather than reactive on this. And the question then broadens out beyond that to say, well, actually, it's not just Muslim communities. There's a role for all sorts of people to play in countering extremism, whether that's students in universities, whether that's artists, whether that's gay rights activists or people who care about women's rights, or just anyone who cares about human rights. People have got to be willing to stand up and say that, okay, these people may come from a different cultural background, they may believe in different things from we do, but our human rights red lines are exactly that, and we should call people out when they don't follow them, and so yes, I think it's important that beyond Muslim communities, a broader civil society response is engendered, and part of that resilience is going to come from being confident in what we're tackling and what we're not tackling. And so let's be absolutely clear. We're not shutting down freedom of religion. We're not criticizing the right for Muslims to be Muslims. And we're not looking to dismantle Islam. We don't think Islam poses an existential threat to the UK or to the Western world. What we are looking to tackle is Islamist extremism, a highly politicized, often violent manipulation of Islam that is pursued by just a fraction of British Muslims and Western Muslims, but who make our lives a lot harder and make the lives of Muslims around the world an awful lot harder than they need to be.
Last question I want to ask you is about the future. How do you see, right, the trends that we've been talking about of how much attention this is getting? You said earlier that they seem to be the loudest voice right now, the extremists, and I would agree with that. How do you see the next decade or even the next generation unfolding in terms of what you would view as being the likely outcome, right? I mean, your organization and you personally are involved in this war of ideas. How do you? What's your probability in terms of there's just a general outlook of how extremism in Islam will unfold, and secondly, what can an average person, both for average Muslims and non-Muslims throughout the world, do to help in the effort to try to hold, as you said, human rights above all ideology in the world, to try to incentivize people to move away from these extremist views? What can people do to try to help in that effort?
Sure. So I think at this stage, I would expect the world to get worse rather than better in the immediate future. Mm-hmm. And I say that with a heavy heart because it probably means I'm not doing my job very well. But I think that we're seeing the continuation of a trend, and we're seeing time after time groups get more extreme. What that means is that they get more exclusivist. They do things like Islamic State have done and tried to hold down territory. They get more violent as they get more exclusivist, and they get more erratic, which means probably that as we start to build a unified response against Islamic State, they will try and fight their way out of it. They'll probably commit terrorist attacks at increased rate in the Western world, and they will be very, very defensive about the borders that they think they have. They will look to shock us. They will probably start to turn more on Shia Muslims in Iraq and Syria, and also more on Sunni Muslims who don't join up with them, and in that way become more takfiri, more exclusivist in applying their dogma to refuse anyone who doesn't sign up to their narrow worldview. And the one benefit of that is that they'll probably get smaller and smaller. And if we can respond in the right way, not simply seeing it as a military threat, but seeing it as a full spectrum threat, as an ideological threat, as a narrative threat as well. And if we can respond in the right way, then I think we can take advantage of their getting smaller. But crucially, we've got to offer an alternative to people who might otherwise be tempted. And so I think how we respond to that offering an alternative is really going to be the key influencer in how these longer trends go. And that's an alternative for Western Muslims. We've got to show that there's something else for them to believe in. But it's also an alternative for the people of Syria and Iraq between a secular dictator who's willing to kill his own people, Bashar al-Assad, and a theocratic dictator who's willing to kill his own people in Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We've got to show the millions of people in Syria and Iraq that their future can include human rights and can include peace and stability. And so it may not look like we are close to a diplomatic or political solution at the moment, and it may seem that the only option at the minute in that part of the world is a military one. But I think we've got to continue pursuing these other options as well. And really, if we see this as a generational struggle, and we see a poisonous ideology as the root cause of this struggle, as well as all the other political causes in the region, then I think we should be investing in trying to find that middle ground and trying to find an alternative for the people of Syria and Iraq. And so I think Quilliam's work is going to be increasingly international. At the moment, we do an awful lot domestically, but this is a global struggle, and so I think we're going to be doing a lot more in partnership with other countries in Europe, And I hope with other countries like the US and Canada and Australia. But I hope also we can start to travel more around the Middle East and talk to Middle Eastern communities who, quite frankly, are tired of dictators, whether they're religious or not, telling them how to live their lives. And I think we've got to offer them hope. When people don't have hope, they turn to dark solutions. We've got to offer the people of the Middle East hope, and I hope that Quilliam can take a role in that. What can everyone else do? Well, I hope that they can help Quilliam grow, not just financially, although as a small not-for-profit in London, that's obviously welcome, but in supporting our values and in challenging extremism when they see it. When jihadist insurgencies come into Western Europe, as we've seen in the last month in Paris, for example, it's clear that they can only thrive when there's an atmosphere that tacitly supports them. If we can shut down this non-violent Islamist atmosphere in which these jihadists thrive, then we can start to starve jihadists from oxygen, and it's only then that we can start to make real progress. And so people around the world, I think, can help by challenging extremism when they see it, but doing so in a human rights friendly way and in a non-profiling way. It's only through having a firm values base that we're going to make progress on this. And so I hope that other organizations can pop up, that they can continue to be interested in this field, but that interest won't be a repressive interest or a bigoted interest or a response to extremism that falls back on more forms of extremism. I hope that people around the world can help out online by challenging extremism when they see it, or offline in offering European Muslims and Middle Eastern societies hope and giving them something else to believe in, and engaging with them as humans. This is a human problem. We're going to need human solutions.
Very good. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the show and taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Good to meet you.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.